Blood-stained and broken, he pushed through polished doors. 5 elegant diners froze mid-conversation. The Bellamy name commanded respect throughout the city, a dynasty built on determination and ruthless business acumen. Alexander Bellamy had transformed a single struggling bistro into the Crystal Palace, the crown jewel of his restaurant empire that now spanned 3 states. Tonight's charity gala marked 40 years since that first investment, a carefully orchestrated celebration of success, with the city's elite in attendance. The dining room glowed under the warm light of crystal chandeliers. Waiters in crisp white shirts moved between tables with practiced precision, refilling champagne flutes and delivering meticulously plated entrees. Thomas Bellamy, Alexander's son and the company's chief financial officer, checked his watch for the 3rd time in as many minutes. "They're late," he muttered to his wife Elise, who sat beside him in a pristine white blouse, her hair pulled back into a tight chignon. "Your father's important investors are always late," she replied, her fingers tapping against the white tablecloth. "It gives them a sense of power." Across from them sat Michael Westfield, their legal counsel, in a tailored navy suit that matched Thomas's. Rebecca Bellamy, Alexander's daughter, adjusted the strap of her red dress and glanced toward the entrance. At 32, she remained the family enigma, brilliant but restless, having recently returned from another failed humanitarian venture overseas. The only one absent from the family table was Alexander himself, busy greeting guests and orchestrating what would be the night's centerpiece, the announcement of their expansion into international markets. "He's making his rounds," Rebecca said, reading her brother's thoughts. "You know how he loves to be the center of attention." Thomas nodded tersely. "Just making sure everything's perfect. This deal with the Saudis is too important to risk any disruptions." The evening had been meticulously planned. Cocktails, dinner, speeches, and then Alexander would sign the ceremonial agreement that would cement the family's legacy. Everything was proceeding exactly as Thomas had outlined in his 12-page event brief. Until it wasn't. The sound came first. Heavy, irregular footsteps that didn't match the smooth, practiced movements of the staff. Then the murmurs, rippling through the crowd like wind through tall grass. Rebecca turned toward the commotion and felt her breath catch. He stood in the entrance to the main dining room, a man so out of place he might as well have stepped in from another world. Grey hair and beard, unkempt and wild, framed a weathered face. His white button-up shirt was stained with what looked disturbingly like dried blood, visible beneath a worn tweed jacket. His jeans were torn at the knees, revealing scraped skin beneath. In one hand, he clutched something small and wooden, his knuckles white with tension. For 3 heartbeats, the room fell silent. Rebecca watched as expressions shifted from shock to disgust to discomfort around the room. The man's eyes, surprisingly clear and blue, scanned the tables until they locked onto something or someone across the room. The maitre d' approached quickly, his professional smile strained. "Sir, I'm afraid this is a private event. I'll have to ask you to leave." The man didn't acknowledge him, continuing to stare into the crowd. "Alexander," he said, his voice rough but carrying clearly in the hushed room. "Alexander Bellamy." Rebecca's father emerged from a cluster of investors, his face instantly hardening at the interruption. Alexander Bellamy, at 67, maintained the commanding presence that had defined his career. Silver-haired, immaculately dressed in a charcoal suit, with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Handle this," he instructed the maitre d' curtly before turning his back on the disruption. 2 security guards materialized, moving purposefully toward the intruder. "Wait," Rebecca said, standing abruptly. She wasn't sure what compelled her to intervene, perhaps the strange dignity in the man's bearing, or the deliberate way he'd spoken her father's name. "I'll handle this." Thomas grabbed her wrist. "Sit down," he hissed. "Security will take care of it." She pulled free. "It'll cause less of a scene if I escort him out personally." Before Thomas could protest further, she crossed the room, conscious of every eye tracking her movement. Up close, the man smelled of sweat and city streets. A jagged scar ran from his temple to his jaw, partially hidden by his beard. His eyes, though, they were startlingly lucid, focused on her approach with unnerving intensity. "Sir," she said quietly, "I'm Rebecca Bellamy. This is a private event, but I'd be happy to help you find somewhere else to go." "Rebecca," he repeated, studying her face with uncomfortable familiarity. "You were named after your grandmother. You have her eyes." She stiffened, taking an involuntary step back. "How would you know that?" "I need to speak with your father." His fingers tightened around the small wooden object, a crudely carved cross, she realized. "That's not possible right now. Please let me help you outside, and maybe we can—" "He has to face what he did," the man interrupted, his voice dropping to a whisper, "before it's too late for both of us." The security guards arrived at her side. "Miss Bellamy, we'll handle this." 3 minutes, the man said quickly. "Ask him about Matthew 12, verse 31. The guards took his arms, but he didn't resist, his eyes remaining fixed on Rebecca. 3 minutes, he repeated. "That's all I'm asking for." As they led him away, Rebecca felt a peculiar hollowness in her chest. The strange man hadn't struggled or shouted. He'd simply stated his purpose with the quiet certainty of someone who knew exactly why he had come. She returned to the table, where Thomas was already on his phone, likely instructing security to strengthen their perimeter. "What did he want?" Elise asked, her voice tight with disapproval. Rebecca sat down slowly. "He asked for Father, by name." "I probably read it on the charity invitation," Thomas dismissed, "or in one of those business magazines Father's always appearing in. He knew I was named after grandmother." Rebecca turned to look at her father, now smiling and shaking hands as if nothing had happened. "And he mentioned a Bible verse, Matthew 12, verse 31. Michael, who had remained silent during the exchange, looked up with sudden interest. "What exactly did he say?" "He said to ask my father about it, that he needed to face what he did," Thomas scoffed. "Some religious nutcase. They're always targeting successful people, claiming moral superiority while asking for handouts." He returned to his salmon, the matter concluded in his mind. But Rebecca couldn't shake the encounter so easily. She pulled out her phone beneath the table and searched for the verse. "Therefore I tell you, every sin and blasphemy will be forgiven people, but the blasphemy against the Spirit will not be forgiven." She stared at the words, an inexplicable chill running through her. Why would this stranger reference unforgiven sins in connection with her father? The remainder of dinner passed in a blur of forced conversation and feigned interest. Rebecca watched her father work the room with his trademark charm, showing no sign that the interruption had affected him. Yet twice she caught him glancing toward the entrance, a fleeting shadow crossing his features, before the practiced smile returned. Later, as guests began to depart, Rebecca found herself drawn to the kitchen, where staff were cleaning up. The head chef, Marco, had been with the family for nearly 20 years. "Did security say anything about where they took that man?" she asked casually. Marco glanced around before answering. "They just escorted him off the property. Your father told them not to call the police, said it would create unnecessary attention." Rebecca frowned. "That's unusual for him. Between us?" Marco lowered his voice. "Your father seemed shaken when I brought him his whiskey afterward. I've never seen him like that." Outside, the night air was cool against her skin as Rebecca slipped away from the lingering guests. The parking lot was nearly empty now, the valets huddled near their stand. She scanned the perimeter, not sure what she was looking for until she saw it. A figure sitting on a bench at the edge of the property, just beyond the decorative iron fence. He hadn't gone far. Rebecca hesitated only briefly before making her decision. She approached the gate, nodding to the security guard, who recognized her immediately. "Everything all right, Miss Bellamy?" "Yes, just getting some air." She gestured toward the bench. "Is that the man from earlier?" The guard nodded. He hasn't caused any more trouble, just sitting there for the past hour. I'm going to speak with him. Miss Bellamy, I don't think that's... It's fine. I'll stay within sight. She didn't wait for his response before slipping through the gate. The man didn't look up as she approached, his fingers still working the small wooden cross, turning it over and over. "You're still here," Rebecca said, stopping a few feet away. "I've waited 12 years, he replied without looking up. "A few more hours makes little difference." The number struck her as odd, specific, deliberate. "What happened 12 years ago?" Now he raised his head, the security lights casting harsh shadows across his weathered face. "You don't know, do you? None of you know." There was no accusation in his voice, only a profound weariness. "Know what? My name is Daniel Shepherd," he said. "I was your father's business partner when it all began." Rebecca stared at him, trying to reconcile this ragged figure with the polished businessman her father associated with. "That's impossible. My father started the business alone. It's the story he's told 1,000 times." Daniel smiled faintly. "Stories can be rewritten when the other author disappears." He reached into his jacket pocket, withdrawing a folded paper, yellowed with age. "I've carried this for 12 years. Maybe it's time someone else read it." She hesitated before taking it. "What is this?" "The last letter I wrote to your father before everything fell apart, before I became invisible." The paper felt fragile between her fingers. She unfolded it carefully, revealing handwriting that was once precise, but now showed signs of having been read and refolded countless times. "Alexander, by the time you read this, the papers will be signed, and you'll have what you wanted, sole ownership of everything we built together. I don't write this in anger, though perhaps I should. I write it in grief for what we once were to each other and for what might have been had greed not poisoned your heart. You once told me that success required sacrifice. I never imagined I would be that sacrifice. The discrepancies your accountant discovered were planted by your own hand. We both know this truth. The evidence you provided to the investors, to my wife, to our friends, fabricated with meticulous care to ensure I would lose everything while you emerged untainted. I'm leaving because fighting you would destroy what remains of my dignity. But remember this, no empire built on betrayal can truly prosper. Someday, the foundation will crack. One day, I will return, not for vengeance, but because even in this darkest moment, I believe redemption is possible for both of us. Until then, I will pray for you daily, that your heart might soften before it hardens beyond recall." Matthew 12:31. Daniel Rebecca read the letter twice, her hands trembling slightly. "This can't be true." "Search the original incorporation documents," Daniel said simply. "Ask Philippe Laurent. He was our attorney before your Mr. Westfield. The truth has been buried, not erased. If what you're saying is true, why come back now? Why not expose him years ago?" Daniel lifted his gaze to the stars, barely visible above the city lights. "I tried to hate him. For years I nurtured that hatred, watched it grow like a cancer." His fingers tightened around the wooden cross. "But hatred is a poor companion on cold nights. It keeps you warm, but burns you hollow." He turned the cross toward her, revealing intricate carvings on its surface, tiny scenes depicting what appeared to be a journey, carved with remarkable skill despite the crude materials. "I made this during my first year on the streets. Each mark represents a step away from bitterness." He traced one of the carvings. "And then, 3 months ago, I received my diagnosis. Terminal. 6 months. Perhaps less." Rebecca felt a knot form in her throat. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It clarified things." He tucked the cross away. "I realized I couldn't die with this weight between us. Not for his sake, perhaps not even for mine, but because some wounds need to be exposed to heal. Your family lives in a beautiful illusion, Rebecca, but illusions offer poor shelter when storms come." The security guard was watching them intently now, speaking into his radio. Rebecca knew their conversation wouldn't remain private much longer. "Come back tomorrow," she said suddenly. "Not to the restaurant, to my apartment." She pulled a business card from her clutch and wrote her address on the back. 3 o'clock. I want to hear everything. Daniel took the card, studying it before carefully placing it in his pocket. He'll try to discredit me, make me sound delusional. Probably, she agreed. But I've always had a problem with accepting things at face value. She stood, suddenly aware of approaching footsteps. One more thing, those bloodstains. Are you hurt? A shadow of something, pain perhaps, or memory crossed his face. Not my blood, he said quietly. I tried to help a young man being beaten in an alley near the shelter. Some battles leave visible marks, others don't. The security guard arrived, positioning himself protectively near Rebecca. Miss Bellamy, your father is asking for you. She nodded, then turned back to Daniel. Tomorrow, she said firmly. 3 o'clock. As she walked back toward the glittering restaurant, Rebecca felt as though she was seeing it through new eyes. The opulence suddenly garish, the foundations suddenly suspect. The small wooden cross had left an impression on her mind, its rough-carved journey a stark contrast to the slick, polished world she'd always known. She had never questioned her father's narrative. Why would she? Alexander Bellamy's rise from humble restaurateur to hospitality mogul was legendary. The self-made man who transformed a failing bistro into an empire through sheer force of will and business acumen. His story had been featured in business magazines, taught in case studies. To suggest it was built on betrayal was to challenge not just family history, but public record. Yet something about Daniel Shepard's quiet certainty had reached beyond her skepticism. The letter, with its faded ink and worn creases, carried an authenticity that couldn't be easily dismissed. Inside, the celebration was winding down. Her father stood with the remaining guests, raising a toast to the future. His voice carried across the room, confident and commanding. To new horizons, new partnerships, and the legacy we continue to build together. Glasses clinked as Rebecca rejoined her family at the main table. Her father's eyes found hers, narrowing slightly at her prolonged absence. "Where did you disappear to?" Thomas asked under his breath. "Getting some air," she replied, reaching for her water glass. Thomas didn't look convinced, but the arrival of their father at the table prevented further questioning. "A triumphant evening," Alexander declared, clapping Thomas on the shoulder. "The Saudis are fully committed. We sign final papers next week." He turned to Rebecca with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "And our prodigal daughter returns to the fold just in time for our greatest expansion." Rebecca met his gaze steadily. "Speaking of returns, I had an interesting conversation outside." The slight tightening around her father's eyes was almost imperceptible. "Oh?" "With Daniel Shepard." The name fell between them like a stone into still water. For a moment, brief but unmistakable, Alexander Bellamy's carefully constructed facade cracked. Fear flashed in his eyes, quickly replaced by something harder. "He's still here?" Thomas asked, glancing toward the door. "Should I call security again?" Alexander recovered smoothly, waving a dismissive hand. "That poor man. I didn't recognize him at first, but I believe he worked as a dishwasher in one of our locations years ago. He suffered some kind of breakdown. Delusions, paranoia. I'd heard he'd become homeless." He sighed with well-practiced compassion. "Mental illness is a terrible thing." "He says he was your business partner," Rebecca pressed, "that you forced him out and rewrote the company history." Alexander laughed, the sound deliberately loud enough to be heard by nearby tables. "Is that what he told you? Oh, my dear. This is exactly what his doctors warned about. He creates elaborate fantasies involving successful people he's encountered." He lowered his voice, leaning closer. "He was fired for stealing, Rebecca. We didn't press charges out of pity. If he's fixating on me again, perhaps it's time to reconsider that mercy." The explanation was smooth, logical, delivered with just the right note of regretful concern. It slotted perfectly into the realm of possibility: the delusional former employee, the magnanimous employer, the sad intersection of mental illness and memory. "Of course," Rebecca said, her tone neutral. "That makes more sense." I'll have security ensure he leaves the property entirely, Thomas said, already reaching for his phone. No, Alexander said sharply, then modulated his tone. No, that won't be necessary. He's harmless, just confused. Let's not create a scene that might overshadow tonight's success. He smiled at Rebecca. You always had a soft heart, just like your mother. But trust me on this. Engaging with his delusions only encourages them. The conversation shifted to safer topics. The details of the Saudi deal, plans for the upcoming quarter, Thomas and Elise's anniversary trip to Bali. Rebecca participated mechanically, her mind replaying the conviction in Daniel's eyes, the weight of the letter in her hands, the reflexive flash of fear on her father's face. By midnight, the restaurant had emptied of guests. The family stood in the parking lot, waiting as the valets brought their respective vehicles. Lunch tomorrow? Alexander suggested to Rebecca as his Mercedes arrived first. We haven't had a proper catch-up since you returned from... Where was it this time? Guatemala? El Salvador, she corrected. And I can't do lunch. I have a prior commitment. He studied her face, his expression unreadable in the shadows. Dinner, then. We have much to discuss about your role in the company moving forward. Before she could respond, Thomas interjected. Actually, Father, I was hoping to go over the expansion projections with you tomorrow. The board will expect detailed numbers by Monday. Alexander nodded. Excellent. Bring the reports to the house at 7. Rebecca can join us. It wasn't a question or suggestion, but a statement of fact, the way Alexander Bellamy had always operated, arranging the world and its occupants to suit his vision. As Rebecca watched her father's car pull away, she felt a strange sense of standing at a crossroads. For 12 years, a man had carried a letter and a carved cross, waiting for a moment of reckoning. Tomorrow at 3 o'clock, she would begin to discover whether that reckoning was based on truth or delusion. She hadn't told her father about the meeting. That decision, made instinctively, now seemed significant in ways she couldn't fully articulate. You shouldn't encourage him, Thomas said, breaking into her thoughts. Father's right. Engaging with mentally ill people can be dangerous. Rebecca turned to her brother, seeing in his perfectly tailored suit and carefully controlled expression the heir Alexander had methodically shaped in his own image. Have you ever wondered, she asked quietly, if the stories we've built our lives on might not be entirely true? Thomas stared at her, as if she'd suggested the earth might be flat. What are you talking about? Nothing, she sighed, just thinking out loud. But as she drove home through the sleeping city, Rebecca couldn't shake the image of the small wooden cross, its surface marked with the painstaking record of one man's journey from bitterness to something else, something that had brought him back to face the architect of his downfall, not with a weapon, but with a letter 12 years old and a plea to be heard. Morning arrived with a clarity that seemed at odds with the questions tumbling through Rebecca's mind. She had slept poorly, dreams infiltrated by fragments of Daniel's letter and her father's dismissive explanation. Over coffee, she opened her laptop and began a search that felt somehow transgressive, as if questioning the family narrative was itself an act of betrayal. Alexander Bellamy's rise was well documented in business journals and local news archives. The Crystal Palace had opened 40 years ago, quickly establishing itself as the premier dining destination in the city. Subsequent restaurants followed, each more successful than the last. There were profiles of Alexander as a business innovator, philanthropist, family man, photos of award ceremonies, ribbon cuttings, charity galas. But of Daniel Shepherd, there was nothing. Rebecca refined her search, looking specifically for information about the Crystal Palace's founding. Most articles referenced Alexander as the sole founder, the visionary who transformed a struggling location into a culinary landmark. One profile, published 38 years ago in a now-defunct business journal, mentioned Bellamy and his team, without specifics. She was about to close her laptop when a final search, Daniel Shepherd Chef, yielded a single result. A small article from a culinary magazine dated 42 years ago, profiling promising young chefs. Among them was Daniel Shepherd, described as a rising star with a philosopher's approach to food. The accompanying photo showed a handsome man in his 30s, with intelligent eyes and an easy smile, standing proudly in a professional kitchen. The contrast between that image and the weathered, homeless man from last night was stark and unsettling. Whatever had happened, life had not been kind to Daniel Shepherd in the intervening decades. Rebecca printed the article, then turned her attention to the letter. The mention of Philippe Laurent gave her somewhere concrete to start. A quick search revealed he was still practicing law, now a senior partner at a prestigious firm across town. 3 phone calls, and the Bellamy name was enough to secure a meeting at 11. Laurent's office occupied the entire top floor of a downtown high-rise, with views spanning the city. The man himself was in his 70s, impeccably dressed, with a full head of silver hair and the comfortable confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime in corridors of power. "Miss Bellamy," he greeted her, rising from behind an imposing desk. "This is an unexpected pleasure. I've known your family for many years, though I haven't worked directly with your father since, well, it must be close to 40 years now." "That's actually why I'm here," Rebecca said, accepting the offered seat. "I'm researching the early days of the Crystal Palace for a possible book about my father's legacy. I understand you were involved with the original business formation." Laurent smiled indulgently. "Ancient history now, but yes. I helped structure the initial corporation when the Crystal Palace was just a concept. Your father had extraordinary vision even then." "Was he the sole founder?" Rebecca asked, watching the lawyer's face carefully. The slight pause before his answer was telling. "The original structure had 2 principal partners," Laurent said carefully. "Your father and a talented chef who brought the culinary expertise to complement Alexander's business acumen." "Daniel Shepherd?" Laurent's eyebrows rose slightly. "Yes, that's right. They were quite the team in the beginning. Alexander with his business instincts and marketing genius, Daniel with his innovative approach to food and restaurant operations. What happened to him? To the partnership?" The lawyer leaned back, considering his words. "There was a dissolution after about 2 years. I wasn't directly involved in that transition. My understanding was that there were some financial irregularities that led to Daniel's departure." "Irregularities?" "Alleged misappropriation of funds, if I recall correctly." Laurent's expression remained neutral, professional. "Alexander bought out Daniel's share, and the company was restructured under Alexander's sole ownership. Do you still have records from that time? The original incorporation documents?" Now Laurent looked distinctly uncomfortable. "That would be nearly 40 years ago, Miss Bellamy. Most firms don't maintain physical records that long, but a significant business formation, the beginning of what became a major corporation, those wouldn't be considered routine documents." Laurent sighed, studying her with new interest. "May I ask what's really prompting these questions? This doesn't sound like background research for a celebratory book." Rebecca hesitated, then decided on a version of the truth. "I encountered Daniel Shepherd recently. His recollection of events differs significantly from the narrative I've always known." "Ah," Laurent nodded slowly. "And now you're trying to determine which version is accurate?" "Yes." The lawyer was silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Finally, he pressed a button on his desk phone. "Janet, could you pull the Bellamy Shepherd Incorporation file from deep storage?" "Yes, the original, thank you." He turned back to Rebecca. "Some files are too significant to destroy, regardless of retention policies. While we wait, may I ask what Daniel told you?" "That my father deliberately forced him out using fabricated evidence of financial misconduct." Laurent's expression didn't change. "That's a serious allegation." "Is it possible?" "Miss Bellamy, in 45 years of legal practice, I've learned that almost anything is possible when enough money and power are involved." He spread his hands. "I wasn't privy to the internal evidence at the time. Alexander presented the partnership dissolution as a mutual agreement necessitated by Daniel's actions. As his counsel, I had no reason to question that. And now, with the benefit of hindsight, Laurent seemed to weigh his words carefully. Your father was singularly determined to succeed. He had a vision for what the business could become that was perhaps more ambitious than what Daniel had in mind. He paused as his assistant entered with a thick file. Thank you, Janet. He opened the file, leafing through documents yellowed with age. Here we are. The original Articles of Incorporation, dated March 7th, 40 years ago. He turned the document so Rebecca could see it. Two equal partners, Alexander Bellamy and Daniel Shepherd. Rebecca stared at the signatures side by side at the bottom of the page, her father's bold strokes next to the more measured handwriting she recognized from the letter. And the dissolution? Laurent turned several more pages. Executed 2 years and 3 months later. The official record states that Daniel Shepherd sold his 50% stake to Alexander Bellamy for, he adjusted his glasses, $1 and other valuable consideration. $1? Rebecca echoed incredulously. A nominal amount used when the actual consideration is defined elsewhere or when one party is under duress. Laurent closed the file. I find it difficult to imagine anyone voluntarily selling a 50% stake in a thriving business for no meaningful compensation unless there were significant extenuating circumstances, such as being accused of financial misconduct. Perhaps. Laurent studied her carefully. Or unless the alternative was something worse than walking away empty-handed. Rebecca felt cold despite the warm office. Like criminal charges. Hypothetically speaking, a partner accused of embezzlement might accept a disadvantageous buyout if the alternative were public accusation and possible prosecution. Laurent's tone was measured, careful, especially if evidence existed, whether legitimate or not. Would you have records of that evidence? No. As I mentioned, I wasn't involved in that aspect. He hesitated, then added, there was a period of several weeks when Alexander worked with another attorney, someone from a less established firm. When he returned to me, the situation with Daniel had been resolved, and we proceeded with the restructuring. The implication hung in the air between them. Rebecca thought of her father, the business titan, the philanthropist, the patriarch whose narrative had shaped not just the family's understanding of itself, but her own identity. One last question, she said. If Daniel wanted to prove what really happened after all this time, would it be possible? Laurent considered this. Financial records from that era would be nearly impossible to access now. Banks don't maintain detailed records beyond 7 years in most cases. He closed the file. The truth, Miss Bellamy, often lives not in documents, but in the memories and consciences of those involved. As Rebecca stood to leave, Laurent added, whatever you discover, remember that the past cannot be changed, only acknowledged, and perhaps reconciled. The words followed her as she left the building, the morning sun now high overhead. The original incorporation document had confirmed at least part of Daniel's story. He had indeed been Alexander's partner, not an employee. The dissolution for $1 suggested something far more complex than a simple business disagreement. She checked her watch. 1:15. Less than 2 hours until Daniel would arrive at her apartment. Time enough for one more stop. The city library maintained archives of local newspapers dating back over 70 years. The reference librarian directed Rebecca to the digital terminals, where most of the collection had been scanned and catalogued. She searched methodically, focusing on the period immediately surrounding the dissolution of the partnership. For nearly an hour, she found nothing beyond the business announcements already uncovered in her earlier research. Then, buried in the community section of a paper dated 1 week after the partnership dissolved, a small item caught her eye. Local chef Daniel Shepherd, formerly of the Crystal Palace, was hospitalized briefly following what police described as a personal incident at his home. No charges have been filed. Shepard's wife, Marie, declined to comment on rumors that the incident was related to recent business setbacks. Rebecca stared at the short paragraph, reading between the carefully neutral lines. A personal incident requiring hospitalization, occurring immediately after losing his business under suspicious circumstances. The implications were disturbing. She printed the article, adding it to her growing file of evidence. The picture emerging was far different from the triumphant origin story she'd grown up hearing. Whatever the full truth might be, it was clear that Daniel Shepard had paid a devastating price in the shadow of her father's success. Back at her apartment, Rebecca arranged the scattered pieces of this historical puzzle on her dining table. The incorporation documents, the old magazine profile, the newspaper clipping, and, central to it all, Daniel's letter with its faded ink and worn creases. Together, they formed the outline of a narrative far more complex and troubling than the one that had shaped her understanding of her family's legacy. At precisely 3 o'clock, her doorbell rang. Daniel Shepard stood in her doorway, marginally more presentable than the night before. His hair and beard had been trimmed, though still far from neat, and he wore a clean button-up shirt beneath the same worn tweed jacket. The bloodstains were gone, but the torn jeans remained. "You came," Rebecca said, stepping aside to let him enter. "I made a promise 12 years ago," he replied simply, "to see this through." She led him to the dining room, where he stopped abruptly at the sight of the documents spread across the table. "You've been busy," he observed. "I needed to verify your story." A ghost of a smile crossed his weathered face. "And did you? Parts of it?" She gestured toward a chair. "I know you were my father's partner, not his employee. I know the partnership was dissolved under suspicious circumstances. I know you were hospitalized shortly afterward." Daniel sat heavily, his eyes moving across the assembled documents. "You're thorough. A family trait, apparently." Rebecca took the seat opposite him. "I need to hear the whole story, from the beginning." Daniel's gaze drifted to the window, where afternoon light streamed into the apartment. "The beginning," he echoed. "I was a chef at the Westbrook Hotel when I met your father. He had ideas about a new kind of restaurant, upscale but accessible, innovative but comforting. I had recipes and techniques that weren't being used anywhere else in the city." His fingers absently traced patterns on the table surface. "We were a perfect match, professionally speaking. He had the business vision. I had the culinary creativity. How did you go from partners to—" "This?" Rebecca gestured vaguely at his disheveled appearance. Daniel's expression darkened. "Success changes people sometimes. The Crystal Palace took off beyond our expectations. Critics raved, reservations became impossible to get, profits soared. But for Alexander it wasn't enough." He picked up the incorporation document. "We had planned 5 restaurants over 10 years. He began talking about 20 restaurants, franchising opportunities, merchandise lines. The vision expanded exponentially. And you disagreed." "I wanted to maintain quality, focus on the dining experience. He wanted rapid growth, maximized profits." Daniel shrugged. "A common enough disagreement among business partners. But when I stood firm, insisted we adhere to our original plan, that's when things changed." "The financial irregularities." Daniel's laugh held no humor. "Fabricated, down to the last decimal point. Your father hired a separate accountant, a friend of his, who discovered discrepancies in our books. Money allegedly funneled to non-existent vendors that all traced back to my personal accounts. But if it was fabricated, couldn't you have fought it, proven your innocence? With what resources? Alexander froze our business accounts pending investigation. He took his evidence to our investors, our bank, even my wife." Daniel's voice grew tight. "By the time I understood what was happening, my reputation was in tatters. The choice became brutally simple. Sign over my half of the business and walk away, or face public accusations and possible criminal charges." Rebecca tried to imagine the desperation of that moment, the betrayal, the helplessness. And after the newspaper mentioned hospitalization, Daniel was silent for a long moment. I lost everything, my business, my reputation, my income. Marie left, convinced I'd gambled away our future. I wasn't in a good place mentally. His hand moved unconsciously to his wrist, where Rebecca noticed a faint scar partially hidden by his sleeve. I made a choice I'm not proud of, but even at my lowest, something stopped me from completing it. The implication was clear. Rebecca felt a surge of compassion for this man who had once stood as an equal beside her father, now reduced to homelessness and remembered only in forgotten documents. What happened then? How did you end up on the streets? Not immediately, Daniel clarified. I moved to Chicago, tried to start over, found work as a line cook, then a sous chef. But word spreads in the culinary world. The rumors followed me. Embezzler, thief, unstable. Oh, he gestured to the small wooden cross which he'd placed on the table beside the documents. I turned to drink for a while. Lost jobs, apartments, eventually my connection to whatever normal life remained. And the cross? Rebecca asked. You said each mark represents a step away from bitterness. Daniel picked it up, his touch gentle despite his rough hands. 7 years ago I hit bottom, sleeping under a bridge, drinking anything I could get my hands on. A minister from a street outreach program found me half frozen one winter night. He turned the cross over. He didn't preach, didn't judge, just sat with me night after night, talking about forgiveness, not as an obligation, but as liberation. He traced one of the tiny carvings. I started this the day I decided to forgive your father. Each mark represents a prayer, a step toward releasing the hatred that was killing me as surely as the alcohol. His eyes met Rebecca's. It took 3 years to complete. 3 years to fully let go. And yet you came back. Why now, after all this time? Terminal cancer, he said simply. Pancreatic. Diagnosed 3 months ago. When you know your days are numbered, it clarifies what matters. He leaned forward. I didn't come for revenge, Rebecca, or compensation. I came because the truth deserves to exist in the world, even if only one other person ever knows it. Rebecca sat back, overwhelmed by the weight of his story and its implications. What do you want from me? Nothing, Daniel said. I've told my truth. What you do with it is your choice. Does my father know about your diagnosis? Daniel shook his head. I tried to see him at his office last week. Security wouldn't let me pass the lobby. Rebecca thought of her father, preparing to sign the Saudi deal that would expand the Bellamy Empire internationally, the culmination of the vision that had cost Daniel everything, a foundation built on betrayal, as his letter had warned. Come to dinner tonight, she said suddenly, at my father's house. Daniel stared at her. Why would he allow that? Because I'll tell him I believe you, and that if he doesn't hear you out, I'll take what I've discovered to the business press. It was a bluff. She wasn't certain she'd actually do such a thing, but she needed her father to face what he'd done. One conversation. After 40 years, doesn't he owe you that much? Daniel studied her face. You're nothing like him, you know. You have your grandmother's eyes, but also her heart. The observation, delivered with such certainty, caught her off guard. You knew my grandmother. Alexander's mother? Yes. She was kind to me when we were starting out. Made us Sunday dinners when we worked late on the business plan. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. She worried about her son's ambition, even then, said he needed to balance drive with compassion. The revelation of this connection, this shared history she'd never known existed, strengthened Rebecca's resolve. 7 o'clock. I'll text you the address. Udit, after Daniel left, Rebecca sat amid the scattered evidence of her father's deception, trying to reconcile the man she'd known all her life with the one who could systematically destroy a partner's life to gain complete control of their shared creation. The Alexander Bellamy the world knew, philanthropist, business leader, family patriarch, seemed incompatible with the calculating manipulator of Daniel's account. Yet the evidence supported Daniel's version of events. The question now was whether her father would acknowledge the truth when confronted with it, and what such an acknowledgement might mean for the carefully constructed narrative that had defined the Bellamy legacy for 4 decades. At 6:30, Rebecca arrived at her father's estate in the exclusive north end of the city. The sprawling house, with its manicured grounds and gated entrance, stood as a monument to Alexander Bellamy's success built, at least in part, on the destruction of Daniel Shepard's life. Thomas's car was already in the circular driveway. Rebecca had texted Daniel the address and gate code, instructing him to arrive at 7:15, enough time for her to prepare her father for the confrontation to come. Inside, she found Thomas and Alexander in the study, surrounded by financial projections for the Saudi expansion. They looked up as she entered, Thomas with surprise, Alexander with the measured assessment that always made her feel like she was being calculated rather than seen. "Rebecca," her father greeted her, "I didn't expect you until 7. I wanted to speak with you before dinner." She remained standing, conscious of the letter in her handbag. About Daniel Shepard. Alexander's expression didn't change, but Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "The homeless man again? Rebecca, we discussed this." "I know he was your business partner," she interrupted, addressing her father directly. "I've seen the original incorporation documents." Alexander set down his pen deliberately. "You've been busy." "I also spoke with Philippe Laurent, and I found records about what happened after you forced Daniel out." Thomas looked between them in confusion. "What is she talking about, father?" Alexander studied Rebecca for a long moment, then sighed. "Leave us, Thomas. Your sister and I need to have a private conversation." "But the projections can wait." Alexander's tone left no room for argument. When Thomas had reluctantly departed, closing the door behind him, Alexander gestured for Rebecca to sit. "So you've been playing detective. I assume Daniel has been filling your head with his version of ancient history." "Is it his version or the truth?" Rebecca countered, remaining on her feet. "The evidence suggests you systematically framed your partner for embezzlement to gain full control of the business." Alexander's face hardened. "Business is complicated, Rebecca. You've spent your life flitting between humanitarian causes, never staying anywhere long enough to understand how the real world operates. What happened between Daniel and me occurred in a different era, under circumstances you can't possibly comprehend. Try me." Her father stood, moving to the window that overlooked the expansive grounds. The Crystal Palace was poised for expansion. Significant expansion. Daniel wanted to maintain our original, limited vision. 2 restaurants, maybe 3. Quality over quantity, he always said. Now Alexander's voice took on a distant quality, as if reciting a story he'd told himself many times. "I could see the potential for something much greater, something that would secure not just our futures, but create a legacy." "So you destroyed him to get your way." Alexander turned, his expression cold. "I made a business decision. Daniel was standing in the way of progress, our progress. The evidence against him may have been arranged, but the outcome was necessary for the greater good." "The greater good?" Rebecca echoed incredulously. "He lost everything, his business, his wife, eventually his home. He tried to kill himself, father." Something flickered in Alexander's eyes. Discomfort, perhaps, or a shadow of remorse quickly suppressed. "Regrettable, but not my responsibility." Daniel was always emotional, prone to dramatic reactions. A stronger man would have rebuilt his life. "He's dying," Rebecca said bluntly. "Terminal cancer. He has months, maybe weeks." This information seemed to land differently, momentarily cracking Alexander's composed facade. "I didn't know. He's coming here tonight. I invited him." "You what?" Her father's voice rose sharply. "To my home, without my permission, to face you, after 40 years of living with what you did to him." Rebecca met his gaze unflinchingly. "He deserves that much, at least." Alexander's expression darkened. I will not have that man in my house, dredging up ancient history on the eve of our most significant business expansion. Then I'll take what I know to the business press, Rebecca said, the bluff she'd used with Daniel now deployed against her father. I wonder how the Saudis would feel about partnering with a man who framed his business partner for embezzlement. They stared at each other across the opulent study, the accumulated wealth of 40 years surrounding them like silent witnesses to the confrontation. You wouldn't, Alexander said finally. It would destroy the family name, Thomas's future, your own inheritance. Wouldn't I? Rebecca countered. You know I've never cared about the money or the Bellamy legacy the way you and Thomas do. Before Alexander could respond, the doorbell chimed distantly through the house. Rebecca checked her watch. 7:15 exactly. That will be Daniel, she said. Alexander's jaw tightened, but he gave a curt nod. Show him in then. Let's get this theatrical reconciliation over with so we can all move on. Rebecca found Daniel in the foyer, looking even more out of place in the luxurious surroundings than he had at the restaurant. He had made an effort to improve his appearance. His hair was combed, his beard trimmed more neatly. He'd replaced the torn jeans with clean, if worn khakis, though the tweed jacket remained. In his hands he held the small wooden cross. He's in the study, Rebecca said quietly. He knows why you're here. Daniel nodded, his expression resolute despite the slight tremor in his hands. After 12 years of carrying this letter, it feels strange to finally deliver it in person. She led him through the house to the study door, acutely aware of the contrast between Daniel's humble appearance and the ostentatious wealth surrounding them, wealth built, in part, on the foundation of his suffering. Alexander stood by the fireplace as they entered, his posture rigid, expression carefully neutral. The two men, once partners, now representing vastly different paths, regarded each other in silence. Alexander, Daniel said finally, his voice steady. Daniel. Alexander inclined his head slightly. You're looking, well, considering the circumstances. Daniel smiled faintly at the transparent lie. No need for pleasantries. We're long past that. Indeed. Alexander gestured toward a chair. My daughter seems to think we have unfinished business, so here we are. Daniel sat, placing the wooden cross on the table beside him. Rebecca took a seat nearby, positioning herself as both witness and mediator to this long-overdue confrontation. I never thought I'd set foot in your home, Daniel began. When I left 40 years ago, I imagined returning one day, vindicated, successful, perhaps even powerful enough to demand justice. He glanced around the room with its expensive furnishings and curated art. Life had other plans. Why are you here, Daniel? Alexander asked bluntly. If it's money you want... It's not about money, Daniel interrupted. It never was. Then what? Revenge? Public acknowledgement? What do you hope to accomplish after all this time? Daniel leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped together. I spent years hating you, Alexander. Years fantasizing about your downfall, about exposing what you did. That hatred sustained me through some very dark times. He touched the wooden cross. But hatred is a poor foundation for living, almost as poor as betrayal is for building an empire. Alexander's expression tightened. If you've come to lecture me on morality, I've come to forgive you, Daniel said simply. The words hung in the air between them. Alexander blinked, clearly thrown off balance by this unexpected declaration. Forgive me, he repeated, just like that, after 40 years. Not just like that. After 12 years of working toward it, step by step. Daniel picked up the cross, turning it to show the intricate carvings on its surface. Each mark represents a prayer, a moment of letting go. The process was neither quick nor easy. Alexander studied the cross with reluctant curiosity. And this forgiveness, what does it require of me? Nothing, Daniel replied. Forgiveness is something I do for myself, not for you. It's how I free myself from the prison of bitterness. Then why come here at all? Why not simply forgive me from a distance and be done with it? Daniel was quiet for a moment. Because while forgiveness requires nothing from you, reconciliation requires acknowledgement of the truth. After a lifetime of your version of our story being the only one that exists, I needed my truth to be spoken aloud, at least once, in your presence. Alexander walked to the bar cart in the corner and poured himself a generous measure of scotch. And if I refuse to participate in this reconciliation, then I'll leave, knowing I've done what I came to do. My conscience will be clear. Daniel's gaze was steady. Will yours? Alexander took a long swallow of his drink, his back to them. When he finally turned, his expression was unreadable. You said you're ill. Terminal cancer. 3 months, perhaps less. And you've spent those precious remaining months seeking me out. Why? Surely there are better uses for your final days. Daniel smiled faintly. What better use than to free us both from the weight of the past? Rebecca watched her father's face, seeing calculation and assessment. His default response to any situation gradually give way to something else. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the first stirrings of that most unfamiliar emotion for Alexander Bellamy, remorse. You always were idealistic, Alexander said finally. Impractical. It's why our partnership was doomed from the start. Was it? Daniel asked quietly. We were successful beyond our initial projections. The Crystal Palace was acclaimed, profitable. We could have found a compromise. There is no compromise in business, Alexander replied automatically, but the words lacked his usual conviction. Everything is a compromise, Alexander. Every relationship, every success, every legacy. Daniel leaned forward. You built an empire, yes, but at what cost? Not just to me, but to yourself. Alexander's gaze flickered to Rebecca, then back to Daniel. I made choices that benefited my family, my employees, my community through philanthropic works. One man's disappointment weighed against the good that's come from the Crystal Palace's success. It's not even a question. Is that how you've justified it all these years? Daniel asked, not unkindly. By weighing my destruction against your accomplishments? I didn't destroy you, Alexander snapped. I removed an obstacle to progress. What happened afterward was your own doing, your drinking, your inability to start over. Daniel didn't flinch at the accusation. Perhaps. But it began with a betrayal that didn't need to happen. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew the faded letter. I wrote this the day I signed away my half of our business. I never sent it. Until now. He placed the letter on the table between them. Alexander stared at it but made no move to pick it up. I know what it says, Rebecca said. I've read it. Alexander's eyes snapped to her face. You've been thorough in your investigation. I needed to understand. She nodded toward the letter. Read it, Father. After 40 years, don't you owe him that much? A tense silence filled the room. Finally, Alexander reached for the letter, unfolding it with careful movements that betrayed a slight tremor in his hands. His eyes moved across the faded words, his expression giving nothing away. When he finished, he refolded the letter precisely along its well-worn creases. You kept this all these years. It was all I had left of what we built together, Daniel replied. A reminder of what was lost. Alexander set the letter down and moved to the window, his back to them. The silence stretched, broken only by the ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. I told myself it was necessary, he said finally, his voice so low they had to strain to hear him, that you would have held us back from what we could become, that I was doing what any shrewd businessman would do. He turned, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. I never expected you to attempt. I never thought you would try to end my life, Daniel finished for him. Neither did I. But when you lose everything, your business, your reputation, your wife, your future, in the span of weeks, it does something to a man's soul. Alexander's carefully constructed facade cracked further. I didn't know, Daniel, about the attempt, about what happened after. I convinced myself you'd simply moved on, started over somewhere else. Would it have mattered if you had known? The question hung between them, demanding an honesty Alexander Bellamy had likely not permitted himself in decades. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I was driven, focused on the vision to the exclusion of all else." He gestured around the room. All of this, the success, the empire, justified the means. At least that's what I told myself. "And now?" Daniel asked. "With 40 years of success behind you and the knowledge of what your actions truly cost." Alexander moved to a chair and sat heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 67 years. "Now I wonder if it was worth it." He looked up at Daniel. "You're dying, and you've used your remaining time to offer forgiveness to the man who wronged you. I'm surrounded by wealth and success, yet I find myself unable to do the one thing you've managed from a position of absolute loss." "Which is?" Daniel prompted. "Face the truth," Alexander said simply. "Acknowledge that I built this legacy on a foundation of betrayal. Betrayal of not just a business partner, but a friend." The admission, however limited, seemed to cost him physically. He looked diminished somehow, the commanding presence that had defined him suddenly uncertain. Rebecca had never seen her father like this, vulnerable, reflective, possibly even remorseful. It was as if Daniel's forgiveness had somehow stripped away the protective armor of justification Alexander had worn for 40 years. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Alexander looked between them, his gaze finally settling on Daniel. "What do you want from me? Public acknowledgement? Financial compensation? Your name restored to the company history?" Daniel shook his head. "I told you, forgiveness doesn't come with demands. I've said my piece, spoken my truth. What you do with that truth is your choice." "There must be something," Alexander insisted. "No one goes to this much trouble without wanting something in return." "Perhaps that's the final lesson in all of this," Daniel replied. "That sometimes people act from motives other than self-interest or gain." He stood, retrieving his wooden cross from the table. "I should go. I've said what I came to say." "Wait." Alexander rose as well. "You can't just leave it like this." Daniel smiled faintly. "Why not? I've carried this weight for 40 years. Now I've set it down. What you do with your share of it is no longer my concern." As he turned to leave, the study door opened. Thomas stood in the doorway, his expression a mixture of confusion and alarm. "What's going on?" he demanded, looking from his father to Daniel to Rebecca. "I've been waiting for half an hour to continue our meeting." Alexander straightened, his businessman's mask starting to slide back into place. "Thomas, this is Daniel Shepherd. He was my partner when the Crystal Palace began." Thomas frowned. "Partner? You said he was a dishwasher with mental health issues." "I lied," Alexander said simply. "To you, to everyone, for 40 years." The blunt admission seemed to shock Alexander himself as much as it did Thomas, whose mouth opened and closed without producing sound. Daniel extended his hand to Thomas. "You have your father's drive, but I hope you have more of your grandmother in you than just her eyes." Thomas shook his hand automatically, still struggling to process what he'd walked into. "I don't understand what's happening here." "Your father is finally facing the truth about how he built his empire," Rebecca explained. "Daniel was his equal partner, not his employee. Father fabricated evidence of embezzlement to force him out and take full control of what they built together." Thomas looked to Alexander for denial, but found none. "Is this true?" Alexander nodded once, the motion costing him visibly. "Yes, but everything we've built, our reputation, the expansion." Thomas gestured helplessly. "If this gets out—" "It won't," Daniel interrupted. "Not from me. As I told your father, I didn't come for revenge or compensation. Just acknowledgement." Thomas stared at him incredulously. "Why? After what he did to you?" "Because holding on to hatred was killing me long before the cancer," Daniel said simply. "And because, even in betrayal, there can be redemption, if we're brave enough to face the truth." The words hung in the air, a challenge and an invitation wrapped in one. Alexander moved slowly to stand before Daniel, the contrast between them stark, one in expensive tailoring with every physical need met for decades, the other weathered by hardship and approaching death. Yet in this moment, it wasn't clear which man possessed the greater wealth. "I was wrong," Alexander said finally, the words clearly unfamiliar in his mouth. "What I did to you was unconscionable, driven by greed and ambition that I disguised as vision." He swallowed hard. "I'm sorry, Daniel. More than I can adequately express." Daniel studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you. That's all I needed to hear." He turned to Rebecca. "I should go now. Let me drive you," she offered. "No need. I've imposed enough on your family evening." He smiled, a genuine warmth lighting his weathered features. "Besides, it's a pleasant night for walking." As Rebecca escorted him to the door, Alexander called after them, "Daniel." They turned. "The Saudi deal," Alexander said. "The international expansion we're signing next week. The official company history will be revised to include your role as co-founder. And," he hesitated, then continued with visible effort, "a significant portion of the proceeds will be directed to causes of your choosing. It's not adequate compensation, but—" "Direct it to the street ministry on 7th Avenue, Daniel suggested. "Pastor Michael's program. They help people who have lost everything find their way back." The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Alexander nodded. "Consider it done." At the front door, Daniel turned to Rebecca. "Thank you for listening, for believing me when you had every reason not to." "Will you be all right?" she asked. "Do you have somewhere to stay, medical care?" "Pastor Michael has arranged hospice care," Daniel assured her. "My needs are simple now." He pressed the wooden cross into her hand. "Keep this, a reminder that no empire built on betrayal stands forever, but neither does hatred built on injury." Rebecca watched him walk away down the long driveway, his figure silhouetted against the setting sun, diminished physically but somehow larger in spirit than anyone she'd ever known. When she returned to the study, she found her father and brother in tense conversation. "We need to control this narrative," Thomas was saying. "If we're going to acknowledge him in the company history, we need a story that doesn't destroy everything we've built." Alexander shook his head. "No more narratives. No more carefully constructed stories that hide the truth." He looked at Rebecca, standing in the doorway with Daniel's cross in her hand. "That's what got us here in the first place." "But Father, the business implications will be managed," Alexander interrupted, "but not through more deception." He turned to the window, gazing out at the expansive grounds that represented 40 years of success built on a foundation now revealed as corrupt. Daniel spent 12 years carving notches in a wooden cross, working toward forgiveness. I've spent 40 years building an empire while running from the truth of how it began. Rebecca watched her father, seeing him truly for perhaps the first time. Not the titan of industry or the demanding patriarch, but a man confronting the moral compromise at the heart of his life's work. "What will you do now?" she asked quietly. Alexander turned, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think it's time I learned what Daniel discovered with his carved cross." Thomas looked between them in confusion. "What are you talking about? What carved cross?" Rebecca opened her palm, revealing the small wooden object with its intricate markings. "Each notch represents a step away from bitterness toward forgiveness," she explained. "A journey from hatred to healing." Alexander reached out tentatively, his fingers brushing the rough surface of the cross. 40 years of success, and a homeless man dying of cancer somehow managed to live with greater integrity than I did. His voice caught. "What does that say about the legacy I've built? That it's not too late to change it," Rebecca suggested. As night fell outside the windows of the Bellamy estate, 3 people stood in a room filled with the trappings of material success, contemplating a small wooden cross and the profound truth it represented, that empires built on betrayal cannot stand forever, but neither can hearts remain imprisoned by bitterness when forgiveness offers the key. For the first time in 40 years, Alexander Bellamy faced the truth without calculation or justification. And in that moment of honest reckoning, something long calcified within him began, ever so slightly, to crack open, making space for the possibility of redemption, even after a lifetime of running from the consequences of that first fateful betrayal.